I was praying for it this morning, so.
Cool.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be here with Dr. Liz Jackson. She's a professor. She has a PhD in philosophy of religion, and she's done a lot of work with just dealing with hard topics of faith and the rationality of faith. And I just want to thank you all for joining us. And I know that there's a lot of people who watch this channel and that actually really wrestle with having faith. So I'm so excited that Dr. Jackson is here. And I think that what she has to say will benefit a lot of people. So thank you for being here, Dr. Liz.
Thank you so much. You can just call me Liz. But yeah, I'm so excited to be here, and I'm excited to hit these really important and tough topics. I mean, we're hitting some of the biggest objections to belief in God and to Christianity. So I think this will be a really important conversation.
Cool. Well, let's just dive into one of the questions that, one of the issues that people really wrestle with. And I mean, the term for it, I guess, is the problem of divine hiddenness. So if God exists, why is he so hard for some people to find? Why isn't his existence obvious to people?
Yeah, I think, like you said, this is kind of one of the biggest objections to Christianity and to theism in general. And one way to kind of set it up, I actually think there's different problems of hiddenness, so maybe we can touch on some other ways of setting this problem up later, but I'm going to kind of set it up, and I think the main way that people use it to be an argument for atheism. And this version of the problem of divine hiddenness is defended by J.L. Schellenberg. He's actually a Canadian philosopher, and you can kind of put it as basically just a three-premise argument. So I actually find it really helpful to kind of put it as, here's the premises, here's the conclusion, and this is relatively simple. So I think we can kind of talk through it. So here's basically how it goes. It says, premise one is, if God exists, then there's no, and I'm going to explain what this is, there's no non-resistant non-belief. So I'm going to talk about what that is in a second, but I'll just say the rest of the argument really quickly. Premise two says there is non-resistant non-belief. And so then the conclusion is that God does not exist. Okay, so the first obvious question here is, what is non-resistant non-belief? And basically, someone's a non-resistant non-believer if they don't believe in God through no fault of their own, right? So if someone does something that, we can blame them for, that kind of causes them to not believe in God, if they're just angry and they push God away, that's not the kind of person we're talking about. We're talking about the person who says, maybe I even want God to exist or something, and I just can't find enough evidence, or God just seems hidden to me, and so I don't believe in God. I don't think there's good evidence for God. But I'm a non-resistant non-believer. I'm not blameworthy for the fact that I don't believe in God. So, so I'll say a little bit before I talk about ways to resist this argument. I'll just say a little bit about why I think people do think that this first premise is true. If God exists, there is no non-resistant non-belief. And here's kind of the way Schellenberg puts it. Schellenberg says, look, if God is fully loving, which, Christians teach that God is, and a lot of theists think God is fully loving, then God would be open to a relationship with all of God's creatures, the creatures that God loves. But here's a big barrier to having a relationship with someone: believing they don't exist or not believing they exist, right? If you don't believe someone exists, it's difficult to have a relationship with them. And so the idea is that God would, be revealed to everyone who's a non-resistant non-believer. So we wouldn't find non-resistant non-belief. And you could think about like a loving parent, a loving parent would do everything they could to have a relationship with and connect with their child. It's a little bit weird to think about someone believing their parent doesn't exist, but the parent would, go try to find the child if the child ran away, and pursue the child even if the child does certain you can do
Right.
bad things maybe. And so this parent analogy is supposed to, support this idea that if God exists, then there wouldn't be non-resistant non-belief.
Right.
So
Okay.
that's kind of the argument. And I guess I want to say a little bit about both premises of the argument. And I think some of the ways that as Christians, we might call this argument into question. So
Okay.
premise one is this idea that if God exists, then there's no non-resistant non-belief. And I think the first thing to note about this premise is that it is kind of a strong claim. Like, so God is fully loving and fully powerful, but that means that God wouldn't allow one person to undergo 1 second of non-resistant non-belief, like even for like a super short period. Like there's nothing that could possibly outweigh that. There's no greater good that could possibly lead to. So it is kind of a strong claim, because it's not even saying like that there won't be non-resistant non-belief for someone's whole life. It's even saying for like a part of their life, right?
Right.
So it is a pretty strong claim. And I think one of the most common responses to this claim, which I sort of alluded to already, is that there's some greater good. There's some reason that God is hidden for certain people for certain periods of their life. One potential greater good is the good of free will and the good of the value of helping, like we can help each other find God. And if God was just totally present to everyone all the time, then we might not have this value of, bringing each other towards God and helping each other see that there is this loving God. So maybe God has put part of the goal of, God's revelation to the world on us, on the church. And there's some value to that rather than God just being immediately revealed to every person. This kind of is a summary of some of the things that Dustin Crummett talks about. So he has a couple papers on divine hiddenness that I think are really helpful. And then another related point too is that others have suggested there's value to just seeking God. There's value to wanting to know, does God exist? Like, if there is this all-powerful, good creator, what would that God look like? And then seeking that God. And I think if God was totally obvious to all people all the time, this value of seeking God would be diminished in some way. And so these are just a few of the goods. I think in general, there's probably a lot of goods that we could think of that might come out of divine hiddenness. And to say that there's no possible good that would outweigh someone's being a non-resistant non-believer does seem pretty implausible to me. And one thing that's interesting here too is that people give similar responses to the problem of evil, like, oh, free will is one of the reasons we see all this evil. But I think, one thing you have to think about is, does the good outweigh the bad thing that it's outweighing? And I think, in the evil case, one of the challenges is, does evil actually outweigh these horrible evils that we see? But I think it's more plausible with the hiddenness case that even something like free will could outweigh hiddenness, especially hiddenness for a time, because I think that isn't as clearly this totally evil thing, compared to some of the horrible cases that we talk about when we'll get to the problem of evil. And we will talk about that. So anyway. And
wow.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I like those ideas about the, us helping people find God. I like helping people find God. So I value that. And I also value adventure. Like most of us don't want to, like, if we go on a vacation, we don't want or some kind of adventure. We don't want the entire thing just like immediately done for us or revealed for us. So in the same way, finding God is like an adventure, and so I really like those ideas.
Yeah, and it's like you're learning more about God as you go, and even people that believe in God, there's a lot of stuff that they don't know about God. And so I think it's this thing that there's, maybe God is slowly being revealed to us, but I think even, Christians, it's not like we get the whole thing all at once either. So yeah, I do think there is value to that adventure and that sort of slow revelation as part of a story. rather than as
Right.
part of a like, I just want to know everything right now. And another thing that's sort of related to this as well, people have talked about what is necessary to truly have a relationship with someone. And, you know, there's been some interesting, well, so look, none of us have perfect beliefs about God. I'm sure almost everyone has some mistaken beliefs about God. So we can kind of
Right.
start there and then trace it back. Well, what beliefs are really necessary for someone to have a relationship with God? And there's been some really interesting cases. So maybe we can talk about a case that's actually not about God and then kind of think about how that might apply to the case of God. But there's this case that some people have given in the divine hiddenness literature where two people meet in an online chat room. And let's say they're talking to each other, they get to know each other, and they actually end up becoming really, really good friends. And they kind of have this deep and meaningful relationship, even though they've never actually met in person. And we could say that they talk to each other for years and they share their hopes and fears and lives and all this stuff. But then one of them comes to doubt, is this person I'm talking to real? Or are they kind of made up? And they're not really sure that that other person exists. Is it, you know, it could just be a group of people. It could be someone that's programming some robot to say various things to me. And they start doubting this other person's existence. But it still seems like they could have a meaningful and even loving relationship with that person, even if they're in a state of doubting whether that person exists. And this actually, when we apply this to the case of God, I think someone can be in a place where they are doubting God's existence and they're maybe not even sure that God exists, but still in some sense have that relationship with God. I think it can be rational for people who don't believe in God to pray and to think like, well, if God exists, these actions would be so good and so important that I'm gonna kind of take them anyway. And so some people have argued that you could actually have a meaningful relationship with God even without an explicit belief that God exists, even when you're seriously doubting whether God exists. So those are sort of some reasons you might doubt premise one. The premise was that if God exists, then there's no non-resistant non-belief. So maybe I'll just, for the sake of time, sort of briefly say another way you can go in the hiddenness argument is you can try to argue that there is no non-resistant non-belief. So that means that the people that don't believe in God, they are in some way responsible or blameworthy for that fact. And you know, I do think, in my opinion, it is hard to argue this. It's hard to know if people are resistant and if people aren't resistant. And it does seem like a pretty strong claim to say there's no non-resistant non-belief. But on the other hand, identifying motives is really tricky. And even within ourselves, I think our motives are often unclear to us. They can be difficult to ascertain. You could think about someone, you know, doubting whether their spouse has been faithful or doubting whether they're cut out for a career. And, you know, when these emotionally laden topics, there's, you know, wishful thinking and self-deception, and we don't always even know what our own motives are, right? And so then, in a way, you can actually pose this as a challenge for the premise. You can say, look, it would actually be kind of hard to establish that, you know, someone is truly a non-resistant non-believer, given how hard it is to sort of really know what people's true motives are, if we can't even know what our own motives are, you know what I mean? And so this is something, I had a professor at Notre Dame, Michael Ray, and he's done a lot of work on divine hiddenness. And this is something he talks about. And basically he says, look, because motives are so complex, maybe we shouldn't be so confident that there's lots and lots of non-resistant non-believers. And also note that it seems like the more non-resistant non-believers there are, the more the more this will count as evidence against theism. So if there's a world with like one non-resistant non-believer versus a world with millions of non-resistant non-believers, those seem like different. Like the second one seems like it's a lot more evidence against theism than the first one. And, you know, it would also seem like you would need more greater goods to explain this non-resistant non-belief than to explain the one where there's only one non-resistant non-believer. So I think there's something too to be said for arguments that say there's less non-resistant non-belief than we might have thought. you know, and I think, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, if there is someone like right now, there's someone watching right now who would say, I'm a non-resistant non-believer. And there's several people that have been invited to come to this that will say they're non-resistant non-believers. And that not only are they non-resistant, the person that's watching right now, he actually tried very hard for many years to find God. So what would you say to that person? Like what is your personal response to that person who tried to seek God, didn't find him, and like, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it is a really, it's a difficult place to be in. And I guess the first thing I want to say is, in some ways, I understand that. I think there's been times in my life when I've cried out to God, or I've been in a place of serious doubt and wanted God to take that doubt away from me, or I've not understood, like, why is God allowing this thing to happen? And so, you know, it's different. In some ways, in my case, it mostly hasn't been that I don't believe in God, but it's understanding these other things. But I can relate to this idea of being confused about why God would allow something, or just wanting God to be more clear. And so I get that. And I think there's a couple things to say to that. And I think the first is that God values and rewards a really, like, an open-minded, seeking heart that wants to know God. And I really do think that it might be hard to continue, but I really encourage you to just continue to seek God in an open-minded way. And so that's the first thing I would say. And I think that's something I have to remind myself of a lot as well, especially when I go through doubts, or I don't understand, like, why is God allowing this thing to happen to me? And I do think too, this is something that Mike Ray does talk about a lot that I think is interesting, is that the only kind of hiddenness isn't a hiddenness for atheists. There's also another kind of hiddenness that's for theists as well, which is like, I've served God my whole life. Like, why is God not there? Why is God not clear to me? And so I do think there's different styles or problems of hiddenness, and it might not be that one answer is the answer to all of them, you know? So I do think realizing that a lot of us go through what you're going through is definitely, I mean, something to say. And I also think too, I mean, thinking about ways that you might seek God and pray, even if you don't have that explicit belief. I think that's been helpful for me as well. Like, you can pray to God and you can have that relationship with God, potentially, even if you are in places of really serious doubt. So I don't know if that's helpful, but at least for me, those are some of the things that I've kind of thought about. And yeah, I think God would reveal himself to you, you know, if you continue to seek him with an open mind and open heart. So I would just, you know, advise you to continue on the path. I don't know if, Rebecca, you want to add anything to that, but I do think, you know, there's the philosophical questions, and then there's almost like these existential questions, or like, how do I deal with this emotionally? And I actually think in some ways the philosophical stuff and the philosophical stuff doesn't always help with the emotional stuff. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add there.
Well, I just thank those who have done their best to seek God. And I echo what you said. I think there's reward in continuing to seek, even when you don't have the revelation that you hoped.
Yeah.
So what is there anything else you want to say about hiddenness before we talk about the problem of evil?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say one last thing. There's so much to say here, I guess. So yeah, I'm trying to pick and choose various things to say. But one thing that some philosophers have pointed out recently that I think is really helpful and important is that there's this whole tradition within, you know, Christianity, but I think other religions as well, which is that God is transcendent. What that means is that God is not fully knowable to us. We can't fully know or understand God. If nothing else, like, God is infinite and we're finite. I mean, that tells us that God is transcendent to at least some extent. And, you know, people disagree about how exactly to understand transcendence and how transcendent God is. But I think given this idea that God is to some extent unknowable, that actually makes it not as surprising that God is to an extent hidden. And this is something that Mike Ray talks about, Sarah Coakley talks about, and other philosophers talk about. They say, look, we've thought God is transcendent. I mean, this is all through the church fathers. This is all through the history of Christianity. And so, you know, to some degree, some of this hiddenness actually shouldn't be so surprising, because God is in some ways a different kind of being than we are. God is infinite and we're finite, and we're never going to fully understand God. And so I do think part of what their point is that hiddenness actually isn't as surprising on theism as you might have thought, given that God is transcendent. So that was kind of a last thing that I think is worth thinking more about. And Mike Ray's book, I think it's called The Hiddenness of God, he expands on this a lot and talks more about it. So that might be helpful.
Cool. Thank you so much. And I feel like we could talk, about this a lot longer, because it sounds like you just are like full of information and resources. But let's talk about the other big obstacle that people have with faith. A lot of people look around at the evil and the suffering that happens in the world, and they say, if there is this loving, good God, then why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? What's your answer to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's another huge question. And in fact, throughout the history of philosophy and especially philosophy of religion, this argument, the argument from evil, has potentially, it's been one of the most influential arguments, and it's gotten lots and lots of attention. And you can think about it like this, like, look, if God is all good, God would want to prevent evil. And if God is all powerful, God could prevent evil, right? But evil exists. So why does evil exist if God is all good and all powerful? And especially evils that just seem pointless to us, right? So maybe if I go to the gym and lift some weights and I'm really sore the next day, maybe it's clear why God would prevent that pain, right? To whatever extent that's an evil. But what about evils that seem pointless? I think this is the real challenge, right?
Right.
And my favorite response to the problem of evil is basically what I call a cumulative case response. And what a cumulative case response does is it takes a bunch of the possible reasons that God might allow evil and kind of puts them all together. And I think they do a lot more work together than they each do on their own. So maybe really briefly, I'll just mention like 6 of them, and then I'll kind of say a little bit more about the cumulative case thing. So the first and kind of the biggest response to the problem of evil is what's known as the free will defense. And I talked about this a little bit with the hiddenness stuff, but the idea is that God lets us make genuine choices, but for those choices to be morally significant, you have to have the ability to do good and the ability to do evil. Yeah. Some people with this free will defense, they also include the free will of spiritual beings like demons or the devil, and they think that can actually partially explain natural evil, like tornadoes and hurricanes. You might think those aren't caused by humans, but some people have thought, well, maybe those are caused by the free will, because of the free will of spiritual beings. So that's one. 2 is what's known as the Soul-Making Theodicy. And the idea here is that evils are necessary for people to undergo certain kinds of spiritual or character growth, and this growth makes them more fit for communion with God. So you might think, like, why would God allow someone to get cancer? Like, that's evil. That's horrible, right? But having a serious illness like cancer might give you virtues like perseverance and trust, and it might make you closer with friends and family, and ultimately shape you into someone whose character is you just have a better character and one that's more fit for communion with God. So that's 2, the Soul-Making Theodicy. Number 3, I'm just going to try to go through these quickly for the sake of time. But number 3 is the natural laws theodicy. And that's the idea that our world is governed by natural laws. So you throw a bowling ball at a certain speed, and you know that it'll hopefully hit the pins, right? Or you open a door, and then the door, you push force on this door and it opens in a certain way, right? And it's good that our universe is governed by natural laws, because it lets us control our environment. It lets us do scientific research. It basically lets us make decisions and act in a way that we can predict. But sometimes these these natural laws, they cause events that harm individuals. And again, this can also help with what I was calling natural evil, things like tornadoes and hurricanes. The idea is that the good of having a world with these natural laws, with these predictable laws of nature, to an extent can outweigh some of the evils caused by these predictable laws of nature. So those are sort of three theodicies. Theodicy means some reason that God would allow evil, some greater good potentially. There's also this view that's called skeptical theism. And skeptical theism is the idea that we may not know all the reasons that God allows evil, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't have a good reason. So just because I can't rattle off all the answers, here's, the 6 reasons why God allows every evil in your life and then every evil you've heard about on the news, right? That doesn't mean there isn't some reason. So the idea is that we need to have a little bit of epistemic humility and not think that we would necessarily know why God would allow all the evils. I don't think we should be too skeptical here and say we never know God's reasons or we never know why God does the things that God does. I think some of that is even just revealed to us through scripture or revelation, right? But I think at the same time, there's something to be said for just that we don't have all the answers. And that's kind of what skeptical theism would say. I also think, maybe I'll just say one more. So I've said 4 so far. So the last one that I think it's a specifically Christian response to the problem of evil. And this is often known as the Felix Culpa theodicy. That means, oh, happy sin. And that might be weird, right, at first. But the idea, this is also a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga who talks about the free will defense, also talks about this one. The idea is that sin and evil is necessary for the Christian goods of the incarnation and the atonement, which is the incarnation is when Jesus took on a human form and then died for us. And the incarnation and the atonement, I mean, the whole point of Jesus dying was to take away our sins. So the world wouldn't be this world with incarnation and atonement if there wasn't sin and evil. And so the goods of incarnation and atonement, they're so great that they outweigh the badness of at least some sin and evil. So I could talk again for a very long time about this. We're really doing a brief overview of some of these huge objections to Christianity, right? But I wanted to at least mention a couple different responses. And again, there's a lot I haven't even mentioned yet. But because I think the best response to the problem of evil is to sort of combine all of these responses into one. And I think when we take all these responses together, we can see the many reasons and the many purposes that God allows evil. And I think, we don't have to put all our eggs in one basket. So if you just say, I only rely on skeptical theism, and all I say is, well, I don't know the reason God allows evil, I think that can lead us to be too skeptical. And like I said, not realize that there has been revelation from God on at least some issues. And we do have certain kinds of knowledge, right? But then another thing is, like, you might say free will by itself, that doesn't seem like it's good enough to account for all the evils in the world, especially like natural evil. Like, how do we explain that, right? And so when we kind of put all these responses together, I think it allows for a much stronger response than if we just rely on like one of them. And again, there's a lot of responses I haven't had time to mention here. There's like the no best world response. There's deontological responses. So if we had longer, I would want to take time and really walk us through the multitude of responses that we could talk about. But I think at least we're able to cover kind of some of the big ones.
Yeah, that's great. I love those responses to the problem of evil, especially the first 2 you mentioned. Now, I would like to make it more personal for those who are watching. What would you say to someone who says, look, I have personally suffered, or I watched someone suffer to the degree that, and even this person, who suffered, maybe they were a faithful believer in God, and there is someone watching right now that has experienced that, and watching someone who is a faithful believer suffering greatly, and then just having difficulty continuing to believe that God is love based on that experience. So what would you say personally to that person?
Yeah. I mean, again, I would say something similar to hiddenness too, where like I get what you're going through. Like I've been through a lot of stuff that has made me question God. And you know, I think it's hard to know. I mean, a lot of it is going to be even just like person dependent, you know, like what's going to help you and what's going to help you really see that like there is a God that loves you. And so, you know, I do think maybe to an extent, some of these responses might help. It might help to think that, you know, maybe there is some greater plan or purpose or greater good, even if it's a good that happens after I die, you know, that God has in store for me, you know. And it might even comfort us to say, like, we don't always know all the reasons that God allows evil and allows suffering. But I think for me personally, the suffering I've gone through and the biggest thing that has helped me is that Christianity says, look, God isn't just this being, you know, up in heaven kind of watching us, but God became a human in the form of Jesus and entered into our pain and entered into our suffering. And, you know, the Bible says that Jesus endured our pain and suffering for the joy that was set before him. And I find that so powerful. And I think the fact that God isn't just up there looking down on us, but really entered into and experienced that pain, especially with the crucifixion, both the physical pain and the spiritual pain that Jesus underwent there. I think that fact that Jesus can empathize with the pain and suffering that we go through, that has helped me a lot. And that Jesus did it for the joy set before him. And I know that I have hope and I have a joy set before me as well. So again, both with hiddenness and with evil, I think I've been focusing a lot on kind of the ways that academics have helped us understand these. And I think those are helpful, especially when we have these intellectual questions. I think at the same time, what Jesus did in becoming human can help with this more existential or emotional thing, which is like, why this evil in my life now? Like, what is going on, God? And even if you don't have an answer, it's like Jesus knows what you're going through. And a lot of other religions don't have that same doctrine that God, you know, became a human and entered into our pain in the same way. So for me, on an emotional level, I think that brings me so much comfort.
It does for me too. And especially that Jesus cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
And so for those who feel like God has left them alone, you know, Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, knows what that feeling is like. And
absolutely.
So, you know, one thing that I loved, you know, I heard you speak at the Capturing Christianity conference, and you were talking about the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. And you said, you know, these are really tough problems, and I have personally wrestled with these things. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your personal experience, like your wrestling with these obstacles to faith?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of things that I could say here. I mean, and like I said before, I think these are two of the best objections to theism and to Christianity. And I also think they're things that as Christians and even, you know, as theists more generally, they're things we should take seriously. They're not things we should brush off or ignore. And I think God is more interested in our commitment to him than to us always being 100% certain and not wrestling with objections. And if you say, look, doubting is a sin, you always have to be 100% certain of God, that God exists and that Christianity is true. What are we supposed to do when we're really confronted with these tough issues? It seems like all we can really do is stick our heads in the sand. And one thing I say all the time to people is God is more interested in your commitment than in your certainty. And so I think, and a big part of what my research is about how we can continue in our commitment to God, even in light of these counter evidences. I think at the same time, as we look into these matters, we can see that philosophers, Christian philosophers and others, they've really given interesting and worthwhile answers that are worth taking seriously. But I think, you know, we might be in a period where we aren't aware of all those, or we're not understanding why God allows some specific evil in my own life. And I think in that case, realizing that even if I'm not always certain that Christianity is true, it can be rational for me to continue in my commitment to God. I think has been really powerful and helpful for me. And not shoving my doubts away, but embracing my doubts, seeking the truth, and then being willing to doubt my doubts. What if these doubts are just misleading me? I think has been really personally helpful. So that's kind of a general note. I guess maybe a little bit on each of the problems. I mean, one thing, and I talked about this a little bit already. So the problem of divine hiddenness, I actually took a class on this with Mike Ray, the person who I mentioned who wrote that book. And many focus on that issue we were talking about before with why would God allow non-resistant non-believers? But I also think, and personally, I think this has been ignored in the literature, but personally, this problem has been one more that I've wrestled with, is this problem of hiddenness for Christians or for theists, which is, why does God seem distant to me? I've served God my whole life. Like, why can't God just say I love you to me, or write something in the stars? Like, I want to know God, like, why do I feel so far from God? And actually, this is one reason why I really recommend Mike Ray's work, because he doesn't just talk about the Schellenberg stuff with the non-resistant non-believers, but he also talks about the problem of hiddenness for Christians. And I think that's a really important problem, and an aspect of the hiddenness problem that I think is neglected. So I think when it comes to the problem of evil, again, this is an old but I think really important and really good objection to theism. And I actually think, in terms of my own doubts and just my own wrestling with things, evil has been one of the hardest things, and it is something, like I said, I really do try to take seriously. And it's like, I don't have a guarantee that bad things won't happen in my own life or in the world, and that can be scary sometimes, and that can make us question God's existence. But I also think at the same time, we're told in the Bible to expect suffering, and to not expect that our lives are just going to be super easy, but that we have this eternal weight of glory that outweighs everything. And we have this hope. One of my favorite verses is in Thessalonians, which says, we do not grieve like those who do not have hope. And so I think for me, looking at the hope of the afterlife has been huge, and especially my own evil that I've experienced. Jesus, he endured for the joy set before him, and I can do the same thing, imitating, being like him in his suffering, but then the Bible says being like him in his glory. So yeah.
Wow, cool. I love that. So how do you feel like, there's a lot of people that say, like, faith is not rational. Like, and I know you've done a lot of work on this. Like, is belief in God rational?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and another question that I think a lot of my research has focused on. Okay, so maybe I'll talk about belief first, more about that, and then I'll talk a little bit about faith too. I actually don't think faith and belief are the exact same thing. And maybe I can say why as well.
Sure.
But let's just first talk about Christian belief. So I do not think that Christian belief is irrational. One of the reasons for this is because there are evidence and there are arguments in favor of theism and in favor of Christianity. We've been talking a lot so far about the arguments against theism and against Christianity. But there's also a number of arguments in favor of Christianity and theism. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument. There's moral argument, or the moral knowledge argument, the argument from the resurrection, etc. I'm not going to necessarily go into all of those, but here's the point I want to hammer down. There's people, especially on the internet, that will say there's no evidence. There is zero evidence for theism or for Christianity. And frankly, as someone who specializes in and researches evidence, I think they're just really misunderstanding at least the common way that almost all epistemologists talk about evidence. Maybe they have their own definition of evidence, right? And we can talk about that. But the way that epistemologists understand evidence, it's some indicator that something is true. And you can also think about it as evidence raises the probability of hypothesis or lowers the probability of hypothesis. It changes the probability. So even someone just telling you something really quickly, even if you don't know who they are, they're a stranger on the street, that's still some evidence. That might not be enough evidence for belief, but it gives you a piece of evidence. So evidence is this pretty broad thing, and absolutely arguments count as evidence. Arguments are like the paradigm instance of evidence, right? And so one reason I think Christian belief can be rational is because of this evidence and arguments in favor of Christianity. So that's point number one. Then point number two, and then I'm going to talk about faith, trying to not go too long. But point number two is I actually don't think your belief in God has to be based on an argument in order for it to be rational. So think about, your sweet grandma that prays for you every night before she goes to bed, and goes to church every week. She's never heard of the ontological argument, right? She doesn't even know what that is. So is her Christian belief irrational? And I want to say no. And I think you can kind of make this clear by looking at the two main views in epistemology about what it is for a belief to be justified or rational. So the first is often what's known as externalism. And this is actually, so Alvin Plantinga, again, one of the main philosophers who argues that Christian belief or belief in God could be rational without an argument. He's an externalist. And so he actually primarily supports this through his view, which is that when your brain is functioning properly and it produces a belief, that's what makes the belief rational. So if your brain is malfunctioning and you're like seeing an optical illusion or something, it's not rational for you to believe that those lines are the same length because something's going wrong in your visual system, for example. But when you're, seeing a microphone in plain sight with glasses that work well, right, then everything's functioning as it should, and your belief that there's a microphone here is rational. So what Plantinga argues is that we have a part of our brain that's called the sensus divinitatis. What that is, it's the sense of the divine, and it's part of our brain that's designed to form beliefs about God. And Plantinga argues that when we're functioning properly, our sensus divinitatis does form beliefs about God. And you might think about this as a case where you go out into nature and you see a beautiful sunset and you just think someone created that. It just seems like there's a creator. Or maybe you're in trouble and you need help and you call out to God to help you. These are cases where I think your sensus divinitatis is triggered and you're functioning properly when you form those beliefs about God. So that's sort of the externalist side. The internalist side we've actually kind of already covered, but part of the idea here, so if you're an internalist, what it is for a belief to be rational is that it's based on good evidence. This is called internalist. Externalist is about how your brain is functioning. You look at it externally. Internalism is saying, do I have good evidence? Can I think about, what's the evidence or reasons I have for this belief? That's what makes a belief rational. And on this view, again, the important thing is what counts as evidence. And again, evidence is things that raise or lower probability. That means that testimony counts as evidence. That means experiences count as evidence. Arguments are not the only source of evidence. And so on this view, if you believe in God because of religious experience or because you've perceived God or because of the basis of testimony, whether that's testimony of someone in your church or testimony of the disciples, that can make belief in God rational, even if you can't spout out the 5 premises of the ontological argument. So either way, I think there's really good case to be made that you don't have to give a bunch of arguments in order to be rational to believe in God. The last thing that I want to say is about faith. And so a lot of my work centers around faith. What is faith? How do we best understand it? And I think there's a couple things to be said here. First of all, faith is not just believing something with no evidence or believing something that isn't true. That's the wrong way to think about faith. And I actually don't like it when Christians say things like, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, because what they're assuming is that faith is this thing that is better the less evidence you have or something. And I just think, no, that's just not, that's not what faith is. So you shouldn't let them define faith. Of course, people can use words however they want. So if you want to talk about your definition of faith, that's fine. But in my view, faith is something that isn't just a religious thing. But we have faith in our friends and family. We might have faith in a certain form of government or faith in the Constitution or faith in recycling. So we have faith in all these various things. And I want to say, what does this mean? And part of what I think faith helps us do is it helps us keep our commitments over time. So if I have faith that I can, finish this graduate program and get my PhD. Part of what that faith does is it helps me continue even when it's late at night and I'm really discouraged and I don't want to write that paper. If I have faith in my spouse, that helps me continue in my marriage over time, even when I doubt and I say, should I really have married this person? Faith helps me continue in that commitment. And so what I say is that faith is a commitment. It's a commitment to someone or something, and it involves a belief-like state and a desire-like state. So this is one reason faith is different than belief. Even if faith involves, belief or confidence or something, there's lots of things we believe that we don't have faith in. I believe there's a pandemic right now. I believe that my flight was canceled and so I have to book a new one. All these things I believe, but I don't have faith in them because I don't have that desire component. And so faith involves both a belief and a desire-like component. And it helps us keep our commitments over time. And so, basically a huge section of my work in philosophy is dedicated to questions about how faith can be rational. And I think, again, this isn't just a thing that is for religious people. It's for everyone that has commitments, and we all have commitments. So yes, I think faith can be rational. I think it's not just belief without evidence. I think it's a commitment that involves a belief-like thing and a desire-like thing.
Very cool. And I just want to stop and thank everybody who's here and in the chat. And there's been a lot of good questions in the chat. And I'm going to try to get some questions in at the end. But I wanted to know, how long do we have to continue? Do you need to go?
About half an hour or so.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So we will try to get to some of your questions. And this is really fascinating. I'm loving this. And if you're enjoying listening to Liz, please do go to her YouTube channel. It's Philosophy. Yeah. And it's a really, you talk about these things in much more depth on your channel. And, there's a lot more about rationality of faith and other topics. So please do go check out her channel. I'll put the link in the description. The link is already in the description. I'll put it in the chat in just a minute. But so I wanted to just ask, how has your research shaped your faith? Like these different topics that you've researched, have they impacted your faith, and how?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess there's kind of three main things I wanted to mention here. I think the first is that, like I said, so much of my research has been about how different commitments we have can be rational over time. Especially, Christian or theistic commitment, but other commitments as well. And I think part of this really makes me I'm not afraid of doubt. Doubt isn't something that I think is scary or that we should run away from. I'm not afraid of counter evidence. And I want to be someone, again, like we've been talking about, that takes the problem of evil seriously and that takes the problem of divine hiddenness seriously. And part of the reason I'm not afraid of this is because I think we can be rational to believe in God, even in the face of quite a bit of counter evidence. And like I said, God wants our commitment more than God wants us to always be certain, right? God wants us to be committed more than God wants certainty. And I think also on this note, I think it can be really harmful when people say things like doubting is a sin. What are Christians supposed to do in response to the problem of evil, especially when they're learning about it and they've just encountered it? Like, are they just supposed to ignore that and just stick their heads in the sand? I kind of mentioned this already, but I think no, we don't have to be afraid of doubt. We can embrace the evidence, and it can be rational to continue in our commitment to God, even in the face of counter evidence. And this is actually related to the second point I wanted to make here as well, which is, remember, we talked about faith involves both this belief-like thing and this desire-like thing. So the second thing is, I've seen that it's so important to desire God, to want God to exist. Faith isn't just about believing and having evidence. Faith is about this desire for God to exist. And I think we often think about, when we think about how do we act on the things we believe. And that's true. If I believe coffee is going to wake me up in the morning, I drink it. If I believe my car is parked down the street, I walk down there to go get my car. But I also think desire can motivate action too. So here's an example I've given before. let's say your brother goes missing and your brother's your best friend and you're just absolutely devastated and you want more than anything in the world for your brother to be found. And at the beginning, there's a pretty decent chance that your brother's going to be found. The police have some good leads, but as time passes and they don't find him, it looks more and more likely that he's, dead or gone forever or something. In this case, I think your desire to find your brother again can make it rational for you to continue searching for him, to continue to put up, missing posters, continue to go ask everyone you know, and to really engage in the search for a pretty long time, even though you're getting counter evidence that your brother's alive. Mm-hmm. In the case where your desire is motivating your action more than your belief that he's alive, because you might not even believe. You might think it's even less than a 50% chance he's alive, but I think you can nonetheless be rational to continue to search for him. And I think the same thing applies to God. I think we can be rational to continue to pursue God and pursue a relationship with God, even in the face of a very serious doubt, because of our desires, because of how good it would be if we continued to pursue God and there is this all good, all loving creator. So those are, I guess, two ways I think my research has shaped my faith. And I think the final thing, and I think this is something that has actually been really helpful about kind of being in philosophy in general, is I think philosophy can teach you how to disagree well. I think philosophy is a field that's rife with disagreement. There's so many people with so many different views on so many different things, and it is kind of hard to see progress in philosophy. Like, there is some, but it's not nearly as concrete and obvious as science is. And so I think to be in philosophy, it almost kind of forces you to learn to disagree well. And I think there's a couple things that I really think my research and just being a philosopher has helped with. The first is that I really think that people can disagree with me and be rational. I might think they're wrong, right? But I don't think that just because someone disagrees with you, you should automatically say that they're being irrational. That just doesn't follow. People can disagree and both be rational. And then I guess the last thing to say is I really have come to see the value, in conversations like this, but even in debates where there's a lot more disagreement or discussions or people with really different backgrounds. I think I've come to see the value in taking that as a learning opportunity and taking that as a chance to find the truth with someone else, rather than a chance to try to prove myself right and prove the other person wrong, or make myself good and make them look bad. And so I think one thing that my research has just showed me is like how much better things are if we really just focus on the truth and focus on what we can learn from each other, rather than trying to, win some argument.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's great. And I love that you're, taking seriously the obstacles to faith that people have, and just really working through those. And so that's really cool. I just wanted to ask you, because a lot of your research has been on Pascal's wager. So what attracted you to Pascal's wager, and what advice do you have to people about that?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just really briefly kind of explain Pascal's wager. So, we talked about a bunch of arguments, like the ontological argument and the cosmological argument, and these are arguments for the conclusion that God exists. What's interesting about Pascal's wager is that the conclusion is actually slightly different. The conclusion is that you could say, either believe in God or you ought to commit to God. And basically the thought is, look at sort of the risk-reward trade-off, right? If you commit to God or believe in God and God exists, there's a lot to gain. You could, go to heaven, even more, have a relationship with an all good, all loving creator. There's quite a bit to gain, right? So we could say that's even infinitely good. If you fail to believe or fail to commit to God and choose not to seek God, and God exists, again, we can debate about what exactly that is going to look like. But, some people would say you would go to hell. Other people might say you would be annihilated. But either way, things are probably going to look worse than the outcome where you commit to God or believe in God and God exists. And then if God doesn't exist, really, I mean, there could be gains and losses of believing in God versus not believing in God. Obviously, if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, you have a false belief. So we can talk about this, right? But what you do either way is going to be finite. And so this positive infinite outcome of if you believe or commit to God and God exists, that's going to kind of swamp or outweigh all these other possibilities. And so it looks like it's just way better to commit or believe in God than to not. So that's basically what Pascal's wager is. I do think this is a really simplistic version of it. You have to deal with, well, what religion do you commit to? I've talked a ton about that in other interviews. I'm happy to touch on that too if you want here, but I get that question quite a bit. But one of the reasons that I'm so interested in this is because I actually think it gets a ton of hate. People hate it. Atheists hate it, but Christians hate it too. I've definitely seen, super intense Christians that are all about going on YouTube and talking about theism and Christianity, say this is a stupid, dumb argument, and so I actually think it's a really interesting argument, and I think there's a lot of good responses to the common objections. And so in that sense, it's underrated. So I'm kind of saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't dismiss this argument so quickly, both Christians and atheists, you know what I mean? So that's the first reason. And then I think the second reason is I actually think the fact that it doesn't just conclude that God exists, but it concludes that you should do something, right? You should believe in God or you should commit to God. It makes it a really interesting argument. So it's not just claiming like this thing is true in the world, because even if you believe that God exists, like you have to then take that and argue from that, like, well, what should I do in response to that? But this argument actually says you ought to commit to God. And so I think in that sense, it actually takes us like further than some of the other theistic arguments in a way that I find really interesting. And so I think that's also part of what kind of attracts me to the argument, is that it does kind of make this stronger claim that might actually be part of the reason it gets so much hate, because like people don't like being told what to do. But those are kind of like two of the reasons that I found it really interesting. And I guess like in terms of advice, I mean, I think just getting people to take the possibility that God exists seriously can actually go quite a long way. I think even just saying like, well, what if there is this all good, all loving God that created you and wants to have a relationship with you? I think that's actually just like even entertaining that possibility is really important and can be really impactful for people. So that's, I guess one thing to do is just get people to think about the possibility and kind of, respond to that possibility. All that the wager really requires is that you take that possibility seriously. And I know not everyone's going to be convinced by the wager, but I still think nonetheless, like taking that possibility seriously is really important. So that's at least one thing I'll say there.
Cool. We have a request that you would come back to discuss ethics. And I just want to briefly mention that Dr. Jackson has a book coming out on November 3rd, Applied Ethics and Impartial Introduction. So you have a lot of different areas that you've worked on. And I would love for you to come back and talk with Lance. He's working on his PhD in psychology, philosophy. And so he has a lot to say about morality. And so it would be fun to have a discussion. I have a couple of questions from people that sent me emails with questions for you. And this is coming from someone who is, he would probably describe himself as a non-resistant non-believer. So I want to start with his question. I'm sorry. Okay. So he says, in your paper, you boil down the question of Pascal's wager to one should pick the religion that one thinks is most likely. It would be fun if you would ask if we couldn't make that principle more general by proposing this. One should pick the course of actions one thinks maximizes one's chance at infinite utility. And if that holds, it does seem like many agnostics and atheists might already be doing that. So he's asking, don't you think this can apply to, rather than putting your faith in a certain God, do you think it's just as applicable to put your faith in a set of actions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, so I do think that principle, I mean, it might need a little tweaking. And actually, even my principle, you should pick the most likely religion, I would probably end up putting some caveats in there because things are just complicated. It's philosophy, right? But I do say that because in general, I think that's the best summary of things. But yeah, I do think it derives from this more general principle that you should pick the action that maximizes expected utility or gives you the best chance at getting something infinitely good. And so you might say, well, let's say I'm an atheist or an agnostic, and I'm holding out for my brain being uploaded to a computer and then being able to live forever that way or something. You know, you might have some kind of story you want to tell about why being an atheist or an agnostic could still get you infinite utility. And then in that case, I would say, why not both, right? Why not, you know, upload your brain if that, you know, ever comes across, but also, you know, in case that isn't possible or in case God does exist, also take Pascal's wager, right? So I think this would be almost a case of like you're doing a little bit of bet hedging, holding out for your brain being uploaded or hoping for that possibility or something, or supporting that kind of research. I don't think that's inconsistent with pursuing a relationship with God, right? So in that case, I mean, it would depend on the action, right? If there's two competing actions that you can't do both, then things get more complicated here. But if you're just like, I want to support research that allows us to upload our consciousnesses, then that's fine. Do that and be religious. So that's kind of my response to that.
Cool. And that question was from Oscar. Thank you, Oscar. So Oscar, do both. And then if anybody else has a really pressing question, I don't have time to look back through the chat. I saw a lot of good questions coming in, but we only have about 10 more minutes. So I'm going to ask a question that came from Gray. And he would like to know, he says, clearly you have stayed in a Christian education system rather than secular, university. How did you manage this process to be self-regulating to avoid being biased by your upbringing, background, and culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, and part of this, I actually really like this question because I think interacting with people who disagree with you and being able to see both sides of things is like so important. Like, this is a hill I will absolutely die on. And I think, look, let's say you have a really strong opinion about X. X can be morality, politics, religion, whatever it is. If you can't give me the best argument possible for not X, then I think you need to do some more homework, right? So I want people to be able to see both sides of things and to be able to give arguments for positions that they disagree with. So I really like the question. And I guess I'll say, in terms of my own personal background, I went to Kansas State University for my undergrad, which is a secular institution, and almost all of my professors were atheists there. And then actually at Notre Dame, it's actually a quite diverse environment. So I would say it's actually roughly like half and half. I mean, at the most, it's like 60-40, but it's actually a really cool place to be because there were, I did have Catholic and Protestant professors there, but I also had quite a few professors that, were straight up atheists, and some of them had no interest in religion. Some of them, would even actively be giving arguments that God doesn't exist, like Jim Sturba's, a philosopher of religion we have at Notre Dame that is pretty well known for publishing books and writing articles defending atheism. He defends a version of the problem of evil. And there was a number of other professors like that as well. And so actually, and then among the grad students, that was true too. There was quite a few grad students in both the theistic and the atheistic camps. And then now actually at Ryerson, well, I was also at Australian National University in Ryerson, and neither of them are Christian institutions either. So actually, if anything, I've either been in a place where it's like roughly 50-50, or actually a place where I'm more in the minority, which would be at Kansas State and then Ryerson and ANU. And so, yeah, I mean, in some ways, being in the minority like that has been difficult. And I've actually, I mean, I don't want to overshare here. I've gone through, I've been, I guess, sort of attacked for being religious, or really put down for being religious, and definitely felt like I'm the only one that thinks this. But I think, if anything, my views definitely have been challenged. And like, the whole point of this interview is that I really do want to take the arguments for atheism seriously. And I do think there are good arguments for atheism. And I think as a Christian, we should feel free to say that. We shouldn't say all the arguments for atheism suck. You don't have to say that to be a Christian. And in fact, I think as Christians, like I said, these are arguments that we really should wrestle with and take seriously. So I don't know if that totally.
Yeah, that is great. And so thank you. And I just want to say thank you to all the atheists who watch this channel, because I know even quite a few of the people who are watching right now are atheists. And I appreciate that you guys are actually engaging with people of a different perspective. So thank you.
Absolutely.
And so this is from Travis. Why do people create so many religions? Is it our natural ability to imagine, or some supernatural influence?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, it's kind of a question for a sociologist of religion. So I can give some ideas, but I think there are people that are like sociologists that actually just study why are humans attracted to religion. And I mean, I think there are a number of reasons. Some of them have to do with the existential resources that religion offers. I think religion offers hope of an afterlife. Religion offers like an all-powerful being that is there for us. And then some people try to give these explanations and say, and then these are arguments against religion. But I just want to note that doesn't follow. Just because you can explain why someone believes something doesn't mean their belief is false, or that that's a good reason for them to give that belief up. It is this really interesting psychological phenomenon, though, that if I tell you, you just believe this because of this, then people start questioning that belief. But that actually isn't a reason to question that belief, especially if the person with the belief has looked at the evidence. And again, this comes back to a lot of the things we said earlier. Evidence is this expansive thing. It's not just scientific evidence. It's not just empirical evidence. It includes arguments. It includes experiences. It includes testimony. So,
Irish with some sun says, ask how faith would differ from confirmation bias since it has desire. And wouldn't this mean God could punish an atheist who saw faith as confirmation bias?
Yeah, I like this question. I think it's a nice question, and you could also put it in terms of like wishful thinking. Like if you always have this desire that goes along with faith, wouldn't that just lead to like wishful thinking? And this actually relates a lot to my talk at the Capturing Christianity conference too. And so here's what I tried to kind of argue at the Capturing Christianity conference. My basic argument was it depends, right? So if you take a case where all of someone's evidence clearly points one way, like let's say like their sports team is about to lose some game, but they're just in denial and they're like, no, I just really want my team to win. I'm just going to keep believing that they'll win, even though like it's so like, let's say they're down 40 points with 2 minutes left. It's a basketball game or something, right? That's like clearly irrational, right? That's a case where they're ignoring the evidence and they're just being driven by their desire. But that's not always our evidence, right? Sometimes our evidence is ambiguous and it's not clear. Like there's good arguments on both sides. Maybe it's roughly 50-50, or maybe it even supports that God exists, but you're not 100% sure, right? And I think these are cases where our desires can make it rational to commit to God, and even make it rational to, take actions. Like our commitment should be not just like this mental thing, but this thing that we do, whether that's going to church or praying or reading the Bible. And so, yeah, I do think desire can mislead us if we're not careful to say, well, what does my evidence support? So I'm not saying throw the evidence out and only look at desire, but I'm saying it's like a combination of both desire and evidence. So hopefully that helps. I hope that I have a lot more to say about this. So I think that at some point Cam's going to post those videos from the conference. And I talk extensively there about like evidence and pragmatic belief. And I actually relate it to the problem of evil even. So that's a great question.
Yeah, that was a great talk. And I think that would, I hope that Cam does post that. That would be great. So thank you for that question. So as we're wrapping up, are there any final things that you want to share, or would you like to share what ideas are currently inspiring you?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Okay. I'm working on a number of things right now. I've actually just finished up a couple different papers on Pascal's wager. So I kind of had this paper I published initially that was called Salvaging Pascal's Wager, and I finished up 2 other papers. Some of your listeners might be interested in one because it really tackles the question of motives. How can you take Pascal's wager with good motives? And I think a lot of Christians bring up this objection. So I have a whole paper called Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager, where I tackle that. And I actually argue that there are ways of taking Pascal's wager that demonstrate Christian faith. So that's one. And then I also have another one where I talk a lot more about actually kind of this last question, like how does evidence relate to believing something for a practical reason? And that's called a permissivist defense of Pascal's wagers. So those are sort of 2 things I finished up. And then my research now, a lot of it is I'm working on like several different papers on what's called the axiology of theism. Axiology means having to do with desire or value. Again, actually relating to that last question. And so what I'm looking at is the question of, should we want God to exist? Is God's existence, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? And looking at various different arguments. Actually, again, this was related to the talk I gave at the Capturing Christianity conference, and then also how the axiology of theism relates to faith. That's another paper that I'm working on. And so I think this is, we've spent a lot of time tackling this question of whether God exists. Super important, obviously, big question. But another kind of natural question, like should I believe in God? Does God exist? And then there's a question of, should I want God to exist? Should I desire God? And so a lot of my research is kind of tending in that direction. And I think it has a lot of important implications for the things we've been talking about in this interview, especially like faith and Pascal's wager. So those are some of the things I've been working on. I do also, like you said, have that applied ethics book that's coming out as well. And maybe just really briefly in our last minute or so, I think some of your listeners might really enjoy that book too, because in that book, we're not trying to convince you of anything. Our goal in that book is to lay out the arguments and let you make your own decision. So we actually cover 6 topics, and they're really practical topics. Abortion, huge one in the news lately. Animal rights, environmental ethics, poverty and charity, and then disability. I think that was not 5 or 6.
I think that was 5.
Wait, abortion, animal rights, environmental ethics. Oh, the last one is punishment. So like capital punishment, when should we punish people? Sorry, I missed that one. So that was 6. So literally what we do is we say, here's the arguments for, here's the arguments against, you go make up your mind. So we really, that's why it's called an impartial introduction. We really try to be fair and give both sides a shake. And it's also really written in a way for people that aren't experts on the philosophical debates or don't go and read all the journals. They're supposed to be able to understand it. So I think that might be something that some people would be interested in. So if that sounds cool to you, you should check that book out.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'm excited to read that. Thank you so much for being here today. And I know there's so much more to say, especially if you join to hear, about and discuss the problem of divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. There really is so much. I could just tell you have so much enthusiasm about that. And there's probably like much more that you could say about it. So I hope we can have another conversation. And thank you guys for being here. And if you have questions, please put them in the comment section and I'll try to address them or, so God bless you guys. And thank you so much, Liz. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me on. This was really great. And like you said, there's a lot more we could have said. So I appreciate just everyone keeping that in mind as well. But this was a really fun conversation. So thank you.
Yeah. And again, if you enjoyed hearing Liz, please go subscribe to her YouTube channel, Philosophy. It's really, she goes into so much more depth about these topics. So I just really encourage you to subscribe. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.